In this video, Dr. Miriam Baigorri of LIU-Brooklyn will give a demonstration of how to do a quality speech-language disability evaluation, specifically focusing on whether there is a language disorder present.
Hello, my name is Miriam Baigorri, and I'm assistant professor at Long Island University in Brooklyn. I'm also on the faculty of the Bilingual Extension Institute at Teachers College, Columbia University. I'll be talking about ethical evidence-based practice through culturally responsive disability evaluations with a focus on facilitating change at the graduate school level. In order for our students to receive appropriate diagnoses, we need to make sure that we're training our future SLPs in how to conduct culturally and linguistically appropriate evaluations. Before I talk about how I teach my students to conduct culturally and linguistically appropriate evaluations, I want to give you a little information about my students. So my students, before coming into the program as undergrads, they report that they were exposed to standardized tests in undergrad. So they've heard about these standardized tests, but they've never conducted a standardized test, or only a few have. But none of them have ever conducted anything other than a standardized test. And most have heard about evidence-based practice, but don't necessarily know how it applies to the ASHA Code of Ethics. And most have heard about the importance of providing culturally and linguistically appropriate services, but most don't fully understand how to apply it or what it really means. Similarly, and interestingly enough, the students who I have at the Bilingual Extension Institute at Teachers College also come in reporting the same. And now they've had their masters already and they're coming for their extension. And the majority have only used standardized tests. And they also feel as though that there's something going wrong, that they're either misdiagnosing, overdiagnosing. And so they do know the importance of providing culturally linguistically appropriate services, but not sure how to do it. And so I'll be sharing with you in the next few slides on how I teach my grad students and the SLPs who come to the Bilingual Extension Institute, and I teach during the preschool evaluation module on how to go about doing this. And so the first area that I focus on is the parent interview, getting that background information. And there are several questions that should be asked, but I'm only going to focus on the critical questions. So one of the questions that I have my students practice asking is, well, what is the child's language and dialect acquisitional history? So what language was the child first exposed to? Was a child exposed to more than one language? When did they acquire their second language? Where is the family from? When did they arrive to the country? Also, what's the parent's highest educational level? We know that education and SES are linked, and so this may give us some information about the child's access to resources, their exposure. What's the family history of speech and language problems, or the family history of academic issues? We know that there's a genetic predisposition to speech and language issues, and so that's good information to get from the parents. Has there been any significant changes in the family structure? Has there been a death? Is the child in temporary housing? Well, that may affect the way the child performs in school and definitely during our evaluation. This next question, I spend a lot of time with my students because it's a very important question to ask the parent, but later on when they look at their results, they have to also look at their results through this lens. And this is what the question is, well, how does the student's communication skills compare to peers or siblings at the same age? And so we want to make sure that we're comparing this child to another child of a similar cultural and linguistic background. Unlike a standardized test that's comparing this child to someone of not the same cultural linguistic background, we want to make sure that we're making a fair diagnosis. And the only way to do that is to compare the child to someone with the same background. And so by comparing the child to the peers of the siblings and having the parent give us information how this child compares to their siblings or to children in the playground or to their cousins, then we'll have a better idea of where this child falls. Later on, when I talk about when you're doing the assessment, again, we have to make sure that we're comparing this child's performance during the assessment to a child of the same cultural linguistic background. We also want to know from the parent, well, was a child's performance during the evaluation representative of their language skills, of what's typical of him? Was a child withholding language? Was a child not comfortable with the evaluator in this room? So we want to make sure that what we see is an accurate picture of what the child's really like. Is a child clumsy? There's research that shows that children with coordination issues also is linked with SLI. And then we want to make sure the parent comes in with 10 examples of their best communication and where it breaks down. Because that parent is going to come to the evaluation with the child's language in an optimal environment, in their natural environment. And so if we get these examples and we're doing our evaluation and we feel as though it's not matching, then we know we have to probe further so that we get examples that are similar to the examples the parent came in with. And if we don't, then we have this evidence to use to support our results in our evaluation. Another area that I focus on with my students is going along with this parent interview, but now really focusing on language and dialect. And so we want to know what percentage of this language are they first exposed to, and then did that percentage change throughout the years? Did they lose their first language as they're acquiring their second language? Is their second language influencing their first language, or is the first language influencing their second language? What's their exposure to dialects and languages at home, in the community, and at school? And how is the child's speech and language acquisition history affecting or influencing their performance at school or during the evaluation? So after we gather this information from the parent, which with my students, I have one student play the role of an SLP, and the other student plays the role of a parent. And so the SLP, the student who plays the role of SLP, has to ask the student who's playing the role as parent all these questions. And they have to really ask the questions, not run through each question like a telemarketer. No, going through each question and really delving deeper and getting all the answers that they need. And so the student who's playing the role of the parent has all the answers. And the SLP is not done with their job until they have received all the answers that the student has in the profile. And then they switch roles. One plays the role of the parent and one plays the role of SLP, and they get a different profile. And again, they have to really practice and feel comfortable asking these questions. So after that is done, then we go into, now what do you do with the child? And so I share with them the school language assessment measure, SLAM, that you can find for free on Leaders Project. I will only share a few of them here, but if you go to leadersproject.org, you could find several resources and in many languages. And so this is one material I share with my students, and this is the crayons card, and students look at it and they, look at it as if they're their child and try to figure out what's happening in this picture. And then what I really spend a lot of time with are the questions that go with this elicitation task. And we look at the questions and we try to figure out, well, what is this question eliciting? What information will we get from this question? So for example, the first question is, tell me the story of what happened. And I ask my students, by you saying that to the child, what do you think we'll get? And they'll say, oh, a narrative. And then I'll say, okay, then you get a narrative. And what will you get from a narrative? Well, we'll get information about their syntactic complexity. Are they producing simple sentences? Are they producing compound sentences, complex sentences? What's their cohesion like? Do they have temporal cohesion, causal cohesion? What's the lexical diversity like? So by asking that question, that's all, lots of information we'll be getting from that question. The next question is, why is the red crayon pointing to the little blue crayon? And again, I ask my students, by asking that question, what will we get? Well, we'll get information about inferencing, perspective taking. I'll give the student an opportunity to produce a complex sentence, so they have to give a reason and say because. The next question is, what would you say to the big crayon if you were the little blue crayon? And how would you convince the big crayon that you didn't do it? Again, what valuable information will we get from this question? Well, we'll get information about theory of mind, perspective taking, social pragmatic language, problem solving skills, and inferencing. What do you think is going to happen next? Again, predicting, making those inferences. And the last question that this task elicits is, have you ever been blamed for something you didn't do? And tell me what happened. And by asking this question, my students then realize, oh, you can get a personal narrative from this question. So with this task alone, you get examples of language, really rich opportunities of language. And so after this card set, we look at this other card set. And again, I'm just showing you a few of them, but there are a lot on the website. And this is the doggy comes home picture cards. And so I have my students put them in order. And again, they role play. One of them pretends to be the SLP, one of them pretends to be the child. And they have to sequence them. It's not a sequencing task. It's more when you put them down and you put them in order, that helps you make those connections. And if there's too many cards for the child and the child can't handle that, then you put less cards, or you put them and you help make those connections while you're looking through all the cards. And again, these cards come with questions. And we, as students and I, would look through all the questions and we ask ourselves, like, what kind of information can we get from these questions? What valuable information what will this help us figure out? How will this contribute to our evaluation? And we go through them all. And then I share with them the scoring guidelines. And as you see here, there's scoring guidelines for all these picture cards. And they start at preschool level and they go all the way through the high school level, and you score them, and it gives you an idea if there's likely typical, if the child needs further probing, or they probably need some support. But I stress to my students that this is not only it. We have to make sure we get information from the parents. And after we're done with everything, we have to make sure we get information from the teacher. And that's what's going to really help us come up with a final conclusion. And there are also other measures that I'm going to talk about now that we have to include. The understanding spoken stories, picture cards in the SLAM. You read a story to the child and you ask them questions. With my students, we go over the questions and we try to figure out, well, what are these questions eliciting? Oh, by asking this question, you're seeing if the child can understand the story. Can they make those connections in the story? Can they identify the main idea? Can they recall details? Can they make those inferences? Again, a valuable task. The next task that I introduce to my students to is a non-word repetition task. And I let them know that this assesses phonological working memory, speech perception, phonological assembly, and short-term memory. And that these skills have an impact on phonological awareness, word learning, and overall language acquisition. And unlike a standardized test that really takes into account the child's prior linguistic exposure, this task, the SLP has to ask a child a non-word, which they've never had exposure to. And so you say a list of non-words, and the child has to repeat them. The non-words differ in syllable length and complexity and sound combinations. And then you analyze it by the number of consonants correct or the number of items correct. And this non-word repetition task comes in several languages, all depending on the phonemes of that particular language. And so this is an example of the English non-word repetition task. And you see the list of words that start off with the 1 syllable level and go all the way up to the 4 syllables, and with instructions on how to actually score it. Another dynamic assessment task that I introduce my students, and we have a good time doing this one, is the fast mapping task. And so what fast mapping is, for those of you who are unfamiliar with it, it's a valid tool to use with children with diverse linguistic, socioeconomic, and cultural backgrounds. It's all about novel word learning, and it's good to use for preschool and school-aged children. And unlike a standardized vocabulary test that really is testing and differentiating socioeconomic status versus semantic knowledge, and is really looking at the child's prior exposure and not exposure to these words, this, you present the child with unfamiliar words. And so you're really looking to see how quickly a child can learn language. And so you present the child with 6 items, 2 familiar and 4 unfamiliar. And so with my students in class, what we do is we try to come up with different place scenarios and how you can elicit this fast mapping task. And so I start off with one place scenario, and that I've got a play kitchen, I've got a pot, I'm making soup. And I tell my students that I've got these different ingredients. I'm going to include corn in my soup, and I'm going to include tomato in my soup, and I've got the plastic corn, the plastic corn and tomato, and then I've got these 4 unfamiliar items that they've never seen before. One of them I label a cube, the other one I label today, and the other 2 I don't give labels to, I just have them there so that it's harder to guess. And I tell my students that I'm making the soup and I need them to help me make the soup, and I want them to pass the ingredients when it's time to pass them. And so first I'm going to put the corn in. Can you pass me the corn? They give me the corn. Next, give me the today. They give me the today. Can you pass me the tomato? Pass me the cube. And I let them see how well they were quickly able to identify these items. They quickly learned what these items were. They've never heard these words before or have seen these items before, but look, they were able to quickly learn them, just like you would do with a child. Can they quickly learn these words? Or do you have to repeat them several times and they still don't get them? And then we switch roles, and my student is the chef and I'm helping, and they label the items and they ask me like, hey, pass me the today, pass me the cube. And if I tell them, see, look how quickly you've learned the words. Now it's not just receptive, but expressively you're able to say them. And so then I have them come up with different play scenarios and coming up with ways that they can elicit this task. And they come up with such creative ways and fun ways on how to elicit fast mapping, and they see the value in it. So after working with the child, then the next important part of this evaluation is the teacher interview and looking through the portfolio. And I tell my students that students spend a lot more time with their classroom teacher than with the evaluator. And so the teacher can really give them a lot of information. So you want to make sure that you look at their child's portfolio, their classwork, their homework, ask the teacher how the child's doing in those language-based academic areas, such as reading and writing, but we also know there's a lot of language and math. What the child's performance has been like over time, what their strengths, what their weaknesses are. Does the child receive any support? And if so, has it helped them? What's the school like? What's the demographic of the school? What are the expectations of the school? How do they handle differentiated learning? Does the child come to school regularly? Does the child have any challenges? Does the child complete their homework, complete schoolwork? What's the language like in the classroom? What's the language like of his peers? Are they in a dual language program or in a transitional bilingual program? Do they get pulled out for services? And if so, is that helpful? So after they get all these pieces, what they really have to do, and going back to what I said at the beginning is, and this is the most challenging part for many, is that they have to come up with their results but a fair, an appropriate result by comparing this child to a child of the same cultural and linguistic background. As I mentioned, you asked the parent at the beginning what the child's language is like, but now when you're looking at your results, you have to look at it through a clinical lens and use your clinical judgment. And that takes time. That takes, you do this evaluation several times, and you get to see children who perform typically. And then you compare the child that you're seeing, who's of the same cultural linguistic background, to that child who performed well or average. And then you see, where does this child fall? Does this child typical to, like the normative sample that you've just gathered? Or does this child need a lot more support than the other children that you've evaluated? Or is this child doing a lot better than your normative sample? And so it takes time for you to create and come up with that normative sample. And it takes time because you have to evaluate several children on that same cultural linguistic background so that you're comparing that child fairly. And after you do that and you get the parent input and the teacher input, then you know you're coming up with an accurate diagnosis. But I know that in the future, my students there'll be future pitfalls. And I know that because I mentor SLPs in the field who are confronted with misconceptions and myths. And so I want my students to be advocates and to feel secure in their responses. And one misconception they may hear is that, hey, it's quicker to give the self than to give the slam. And so give the self instead. And by giving the slam to each other and by them seeing me doing videos of me doing with other children, they see that that's inaccurate. It's quicker to do the slam and you get very good information. And the last piece of information that I'd like to share with you is that my students in the future may have colleagues or supervisors who are not up to date. And so they may be doing things differently because they just don't know the latest research. And so I want my students to have the latest research. And so from the very beginning of grad school, they're all required to become NISLA members, so they have access to research and to get in the habit of looking at articles and continue to do that when they graduate from the program and are future SLPs, and then could share these resources with their colleagues. Well, thank you, gracias, and I hope that you found this helpful, especially for those of you who are working with graduate students and how to prepare our future SLPs so that we are doing evidence-based practice with culturally linguistically appropriate services. Thank you.
This video and a number of others showing our change makers will go together to form an online course available at leadersproject.org that will also be offered for ASHA CEUs. It will be free, and you will meet your ethical and culturally responsive requirements